In Chapter 16, we talk about the classification of products coming into the United States, and especially classification you will do on the customs broker exam. So if you are ready, we're going to jump right in. The Harmonized Tariff is that great big book you received and are now trying to figure out what to do with. It is about 1,400 pages long and assigns everything in the world a tariff number. The best device that we have found to use on the exam with the Harmonized Tariff book is what is called a catalog rack. A catalog rack can be found at any major office supply store. The HTS is a very large book laid out with the table of contents up front, followed by the general rules of interpretation. There are 6 of them on a single page. The general notes, mostly explaining the special trade programs. Then the main body of the Harmonized Tariff book is divided into 22 sections consisting of 99 chapters. This is followed by an index and 3 annexes. The information in the annexes is used for making entries as they contain abbreviations and numerical indicators for countries and ports. The heart of the HTS, or as we like to call it, the operator's manual, lies in the general rules of interpretation and the general notes. The General Rules of Interpretation, or GRIs, tell you how to classify items and assign a tariff number. The general notes cover the special trade programs and will help you determine the correct duty to pay on items. It is very important to memorize, understand, and be able to apply the 6 General Rules of Interpretation. You need to be able to use them not only for the exam, but also when you get your broker's license. So let's look at the contents of the HTS. As stated, the General Rules of Interpretation will tell you how to classify goods, and they need to be applied in a hierarchical manner. That means first you apply rule number 1, and if that doesn't work, go to rule number 2, and so forth until you get to the rule that applies to your product. The general notes will tell you what goods are exempt from duty, define the customs territory, and help you select the correct rate of duty based upon the country of origin of your product and special trade programs that may apply. The headings and subheadings, headings being 4-digit and subheadings being 6 or 8 digits, are there to help you define the product you are trying to classify. The duty rate columns will identify the duty rate as applied to the product that you have classified. The general rules of interpretation are applied in a hierarchical manner starting with GRI 1. GRI 1 is also called eo nomine, which is Latin for by name. GRI 1 tells us that if we find a description of the product we are trying to classify under a 4-digit heading, then we would apply GRI 1. It is also the most important rule. That's why it's the first rule. GRI 1 tells us to use the headings and the legal notes to classify our product. It also tells us that we may have to use other rules in order to classify our products. GRI 1 states that the index, the table of contents, and the chapter titles have no legal value. GRI 1 tells us to classify goods according to the headings. What we are to do is match the description of the goods to the description listed in the 4-digit heading. Once we have matched the 4-digit heading, we look for 6 and 8-digit subheadings only under our selected 4-digit heading. We are going to look at the classification of sardines packed in tomato sauce in a 170-gram tin. We start our classification in the 4-digit heading 1604. Starting in 1604, we find a description of prepared or preserved fish, semicolon, caviar, and caviar substitutes. Looking under that 4-digit heading, we find a 6-digit heading, sardines, sardinella, and bristling or sprats. We have just matched our product to the 4-digit heading, 1604, and found under that 4-digit heading a 6-digit heading that more closely describes our product, sardines. Directly under our 6-digit heading, slightly indented to the right, we find in oil and airtight containers. That is not us. We have to continue down the page till we find a change equal to the indentation as the in oil. The next change listed at the same indentation is other. This means that anything listed under the other is not packed in oil. As our product is packed in tomato sauce, this is where it would go. Under other, we have 2 selections, the first being in containers under 225 grams, the second being other. As our tin or can weighs 170 grams, we fall under the tariff number 1604 134000. We must be careful when classifying product that we remain under the 4-digit heading. when selecting a 6 or 8-digit heading. As you can see, the in oil provision and the other provision are indented the same distance from the left-hand margin. This means that anything listed under the in oil provision is packed in oil until you get to other. Items under the other provision are not packed in oil. When classifying, we must be sure that we stay within the original 4 or 6-digit heading when making our selections. Let's take a look at what GRI 1 says about section and chapter notes. The section notes and the chapter notes will tell you what is or what is not included in that particular section or chapter. The notes also define certain terms that may be used in that chapter. Let us say you have a shipment of wood molding. On the invoice it was stated that the wood molding is standard, having an embossed design. Wood molding falls in Chapter 44. Looking at the notes to Chapter 44, we find U.S. Note 1B, which tells us that standard molding has the same profile along its entire length. The molding we are trying to classify has a design embossed on it, so the note tells us to classify it under Other rather than Standard. An example of the goods excluded would be in Section 15, Articles of Metal. There we find that the section notes exclude machinery, mechanical appliances, electrical goods, and metal furniture. The notes will tell us that golf bags of nylon do not fall in 9506, which is articles and equipment for sports, but rather in 4202, trunks, suitcases, and the like. Similarly, combs of sterling silver will not fall in 9615, which is combs and the like, but is to be classified under 7114, articles of precious metal. Now let's look at what the notes say about composite goods. These notes will provide us with rules for deciding on where to put products that are made up of more than one item. Let's take a look at a can of spaghetti. The can of spaghetti is composed of meat, which would fall under 1602, pasta, which falls under 1902, and is a food preparation, which falls under 2106. Note 1A in Chapter 19 tells us it belongs in Chapter 16. Now let's look at a can of ravioli, which is made up of the same stuff, pasta, meat, and is a food preparation. However, that same Note 1A in Chapter 19 tells you the ravioli belongs in Chapter 19. The bottom line here, folks, is that when we are classifying, either on the exam or in real life, it is very important for us to read the section and chapter notes very carefully. While your time is limited on the exam, you should still have time to carefully scan the section and chapter notes to see if your product is listed and whether there are exceptions or not. What does GRI 1 say about the other GRIs? Well, GRI 1 tells you that you may have to use them. In the next part, we will continue with this slide.